Hey, Cypher here, and I wanted to talk about the comments section on the Death of Stalin video. There was a lot of outrage in the comments, and this comment right here kinda sums up my entire feeling of it. It kinda came out of nowhere. Just about every comment that is made that is trying to criticize the video is missing where I directly address that comment before they even made it. But I also dug into the analytics on this one because it did kind of blow up out of nowhere. And there is a reason. 4chan got a hold of it and put up a post called "Movies That Make Commies Seethe." Now, I would never call myself a communist, but it's also 4chan. It's one of those groups where if you're anything left of Hitler, you're, a communist. But something interesting on this posting is, first of all, there's more comments on the posting than there are on the video itself, but it's not purely one-sided. There's a bunch of people going in there to talk about the merits of communism. And no joke, a lot of this goes from simple meme-tastic, oh look at the silly leftist kind of stuff, all the way to intellectual discussion. And I mean in that order. Seriously, they go from being silly little kids to actual discussion. So I'll include a link to the archive of that thread in the description below. So yeah, whenever 4chan gets involved with something, you know full well that there's just going to be a bunch of angry commenters. But instead of using this as a platform to just be spiteful, I actually want to analyze what the heck they were trying to say. Because a lot of the outrage comes from basically ignoring the video and using the comments section as a platform for their own view of communism. Either that, or there is of course the most easily dismissed comments. Those typical ones are, "It's just a movie, bruh." I get these comments on basically every single based on a true story I do, as if it being a movie, satirical or not, somehow means that it is unable to be criticized. Whether or not it's funny doesn't change the content of its message. I have been consistent throughout all of these reviews in showing that inaccuracy hurts films. Making it a joke doesn't change that. There's plenty of truth to make fun of. Especially when it comes to the Soviets. It's ripe for comedy. But fabricating a massacre is about the worst thing a filmmaker can do. And by the way, that scene was done completely seriously. That scene was not done with any sense of humor whatsoever. So just because it's based on a comic or satirical does not absolve it of needing to communicate to the viewer that what it is doing is false. Making jokes does not remove the content of the message. And honesty would have actually made this movie a lot better. Go and read some of the accounts which I included in the description, especially that 17 moments in Soviet history thing. Go read those, and it is ripe for laughter. I love the idea of making history stuff into comedies. If you want a good example of that, go see my review of Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines. That is a good history comedy. Speaking of that 17 moments in Soviet history, I think we might have crashed their server because of this review. Seriously. It was up the night before, and by the time I clicked on it after the review had been released, it was down for about 6 hours. I think so many people had actually clicked on it, we crashed their servers. Which, sorry Michigan State University, I didn't mean to send that much traffic your way. But it's also kind of awesome, which means that there's that many people checking my sources, which is great. So let's move on to the second thing that people commonly comment about. At the end of the review, I talk about how Russia censored this movie, and a lot of people have thought that I was advocating that I was saying it should be censored. Now, in no way did I actually advocate censorship. There is no point where I say this should be. This is what I said. It's their country, and they don't need this garbage. You see, I am asking for people to understand why a country might wish to block it for being harmful propaganda. Most countries do this, by the way, most likely including your own. Here in America, we don't exactly have the same kind of censorship apparatus, but what we do have is a ratings board. And if you don't get rated, no theater is going to show your stuff. And so the ratings board will often choose not to rate something simply because they view it as propaganda. So I'm not saying it's right, just that it exists, and not in the way that the press is portraying it. Because the press, as I point out, is trying to make it into this whole thing of like, look at what Putin's doing. You'll find a bunch of comments talking about how Putin did it for this and Putin did it for that, but it's a ministry that did it, not Putin himself. Now, I don't know if he had some sort of little memo that he slipped to the culture ministry, like, hey, this movie's crap, block it. But honestly, I don't care. As I said, it's their country. One must always understand something before they can say what it should or should not be. And saying that this was blocked because the Russians were afraid of it or anything along those lines is just propaganda justifying propaganda. I never actually call the movie itself propaganda, I call it misinformation, which, yeah, I totally stand behind that. Do I think that they should block it? I don't really care. Russians can do what the heck they want. This is a British movie, so why does it have to go to Russia? I never understand this whole, it's a gross violation of freedom of speech. It's not your freedom of speech to push commercial products into another country. That's not how freedom of speech works. You can broadcast it just fine. If they wanted to, they could. But they're trying to do this as a commercial venture in a different country than their own. So I really don't know how else to address that other than I'm not advocating censorship and you need to understand what you're talking about before you say what should or shouldn't be. Then there's the third batch of comments that seems to piss off the people the most. Now, at one point in the review, I say this.
Many of the people who had been purged were still in gulags at this time, almost 500,000 in fact. But those were labor camps, not death camps.
And so there's a bunch of comments saying like, how dare you say that? How dare you belittle what happened in the gulags? Basically they're saying I'm a gulag apologist. You have people saying like, well, it wasn't sunshine and daisies in the gulags, and I never said anything of the sort. In fact, to begin with, I said this.
It would be difficult to list the misdeeds of the time, but suffice it to say, these weren't exactly wonderful times for the people under his rule.
Well, how do you go from that statement to being an apologist? Something that people don't seem to understand is labor camps is just about the purpose. The video was showing people being executed en masse, one after the other, and that's just downright false. These were labor camps. They weren't just going around executing people. They needed those people for labor. Yeah, the gulags were horrible places. I mean, it's unfree labor under horrendous conditions. But that doesn't make them death camps. A bunch of people were saying like, yeah, well that means that Auschwitz wasn't a death camp either. Well, it didn't start as a death camp. It did start as a labor camp, that's true. But it became a death camp because of the Auschwitz-Birkenau extension. After all, the Nazis did not start their extermination attempt until 1941. This is the problem with trying to say things are at one time and not the other. People only think in absolutes. Even though I spent a good chunk of the review talking about how bad everything was under Stalin, if I say one thing that isn't absolutely condemning everything all the time, then somehow I'm an apologist. No, we were discussing a movie that was showing mass executions, which were definitely not happening. People were certainly being worked to death, but just look at the agency's name for the gulags. It was called the Main Administration of Corrective Labor Camps and Settlements. And when you look at just the Main Camps Administration, that's what Gulag stands for. Seriously. So yeah, they were labor camps, and I was not saying that they weren't horrible. But this is where I'm talking about people have to ignore the video in order to say what they're saying. I already addressed these things in the video, yet these people are simply wanting to say their own spiel about how bad communism is. Well, I didn't want to do a bunch of body counting. I'm tired of that stuff. I specifically only glossed over all of that stuff because trying to count atrocities is tedious and not any fun. I do try to have a little bit of fun on this channel. The video was not about gulags at all. What it really was about was de-Stalinization, which means that you sometimes have to talk about gulags, but good lord, trying to count how many people died there and that is a complete mess. We know that 700,000 people were executed, but then beyond that, numbers range from like 5 million dead to 30. Normally those higher estimates include things like the Holodomor, which, interesting enough, people have been denying that genocide as well. Somebody denying genocide, though, that gets deleted immediately. Although I always save the comments for later because it's an example of just how horrible the comments section got. There's also a bunch of commenters who are trying to bring up the Gulag Archipelago, as though that somehow contradicts what I'm saying. I don't see the logic in that. The only thing that I could see is that they're trying to say that purges continued. He was arrested during the war under charges of spreading propaganda. Although these were definitely trumped up charges, this was not part of an orchestrated campaign to rid political dissidents or anything along those lines. It wasn't a massive purge. I guess you could say he was individually purged, but that's not a purge on the scale of the movie. It also happened during the war, which is still pretty much exactly what I said. Don't know what people are trying to say there. Finally, there is one batch of comments that are actually trying to engage with the material rather than just try to dispute semantics about what the difference between a death and labor camp is. Instead, they're talking about factual claims, and these are the comments that I actually pay attention to. So there are a couple comments pointing out that people did in fact get crushed during Stalin's funeral. One who was actually kind enough to provide sources. Now, I gave him my source to begin with on that because I know about the incident, and on the 17 Moments in Soviet History, it talks a little bit about it, and there's a first-hand account. It's great, it's useful. But from that account does not depict 1,500 people. A few of the sources that he provided do claim that the numbers went up into the hundreds, but nobody provides a source for that. In fact, the BBC here actually claims that it was rumored to be up in the hundreds. But I think we can both agree that that's still not a massacre because none of these things talk about security forces shooting into the crowd. In fact, it's all about the crowd stampeding. I'll include a link to 17 Moments in Soviet History in the description below if you want to read a primary source account of it and decide for yourself on how bad it was. But in either case, it certainly wasn't a massacre. A massacre has to be perpetrated, a stampede is accidental. And then the other factual claim that a lot of people talk about, they say that purges were happening in the Eastern Bloc after 1945. And I don't dispute this in the video at all. In fact, I specifically say this.
Now, things were a lot worse for countries in the Eastern Bloc in the late 40s and early 50s, but not for Moscow, where the film takes place.
This is another thing where I just don't want to sit there and count the atrocities. That's not what this video was about. This video was about de-Stalinization. Although I did make one mistake in terms of calling it Eastern Bloc and ignoring one of those purges. Because the Tatars in Crimea had been completely relocated to the Caucasus. Now, I don't think you can really call that a purge. At least not in the same way. It's a deportation of an entire people, and that's kind of different. I was talking about political purges where Stalin was putting out lists and whatnot. Now, by the way, 1944 is still during the war, so what I said still was true, I just didn't include it in the list. But what happened in the Eastern Bloc between 1945 and 1953 was not the purview of this review. I did talk a little bit about the East German uprising, but purely because that's what was used against Beria. Oh, and a few comments have said that I was mispronouncing names, and well, that's just gonna happen. Now, there are some purges that are after World War II that I do talk about in the video, but I only briefly mention them, and as it goes with these things, if you're trying not to get in the weeds, then people will denounce you for not getting into the weeds. But things like the Doctor's Plot, the Leningrad Affair, I do talk about them. That's that whole bit about Stalin's anti-Semitism getting the best of him. But yeah, I didn't want to talk about endless killing. Finally, there is one last thing where people were mistaking what I said completely, and that is the stuff about revisionist history. You'll find a lot of people talking about, oh, this is a bunch of revisionism. Whereas in the video I actually talk about revisionist history and how we need to try to understand their argument, but apparently trying to actually understand the thing that you're watching, that's not in most commenters' interest. See, I was saying what historians were saying about this. I was not taking one side or the other. I like to call myself a post-revisionist. And post-revisionism is essentially the middle ground between orthodoxy and revisionism. The thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. See? It goes back to Hegel's dialectic. And that's the scholarship section. I'm talking about the scholarship. At no point do I say I believe in this thing. In fact, I say this.
But many revisionists and old Soviet scholars chafe at that, since he was part of a system that could have easily stopped the purges against his will. To understand this argument better, we need more social histories of the time.
That clearly indicates that I am not taking their side. I like Sheila Fitzgerald's work a great deal, but I don't have to agree with her to like it. There's a reason why I put those books in the description and on screen. So I feel like I've been going on for a while now. This was done completely unscripted, by the way. Hopefully, I've rendered that comment section a little more understandable. So I'm just going to put a little announcement at the end of this. This is going to be the last video for about 3, maybe 4 weeks. I whipped it together pretty quickly, as you can probably tell, and I have a few videos that are getting set up. If you're on the Patreon, you can see which ones are ready to go and whatnot, and you can even comment ahead of time if I'm being insensitive or anything along those lines that'll prevent this whole mess from happening again. But I'm also going to be traveling for a little bit and just trying to write and crank out some of these things, but I need to take a break in terms of the release schedule just to take a breather. Oh, and by the way, if you're one of those people who have to demean anybody who disagrees with you with some sort of ad hominem, go away. You're not welcome here. And I'm gonna just start deleting any comment that decides to sit there and call other people names. I'm tired of that, and that is not what this channel is about.